These are statistics of the attitude of Ukrainians to joining NATO. Nothing special except for 2022. I never expected to see such a result. What's up, rolls? My name is Sigo, welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, guys, we'll find out when Ukraine will be able to join NATO and what would happen if it did so before a full-scale invasion. To begin with, it's worth talking about the history of relations and finding out when Ukraine had a chance to join the alliance. After the collapse of the USSR, all the countries of the former Soviet Union, to one degree or another, began to draw closer to the NATO bloc. Bilateral agreements on security and guarantees of peace on the European continent began to be signed. Ukraine, in this vein, was no exception. Even the first president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, who was in power from 1991 to 1994, is meeting with NATO. During the time of the second president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, a special partnership charter was signed in 1997. The charter aims to strengthen cooperation between Ukraine and NATO, but it doesn't provide for Ukraine's automatic membership in the alliance. Leonid Kuchma, who served as a president of Ukraine from 1994 to 2005, advocated a certain level of cooperation with Russia and promoted policies aimed at developing economic relations with the neighboring country. However, he also opened the door for rapprochement with NATO and the European Union. A NATO center was also opened in Kyiv. Despite Kuchma's bilateral policy towards Russia and Europe, rapprochement with NATO was constantly taking place under him. Yeah, some documents were signed that brought Ukraine and NATO closer together, but speaking frankly, no clear radical changes took place. And then in 2005, the pro-European Viktor Yushchenko came to the power in Ukraine, and the question of joining NATO has already acquired a real contours. Yushchenko is known as one of the leaders of the Orange Revolution in 2004, which arose as a result of protests against falsification during the presidential elections. The falsification was carried out by pro-Russian people who had the power in Ukraine. And the most interesting, so during Yushchenko's presidency in 2008, Ukraine submitted an official application for action plan for NATO membership. However, the accession was complicated by internal political disagreements and divisions in society. Some regions and parts of the population opposed Ukraine's membership in NATO, believing that it threatens their interests and relations with Russia. At the time, many Ukrainians had a pro-Russian views, and not all had a clear patriotism. As a result, a membership plan wasn't approved at that time. To be blunt, we were refused. However, the promise was nevertheless made for Georgia and Ukraine that the countries would still be able to join the alliance, but in the future. In Ukraine, the problems were both external and purely domestic. As for foreign policy, many NATO countries didn't support the Ukraine's entry into the alliance. The main opponents of this decision were Germany and France, the largest members of the bloc. Other Western European countries were not also supportive of this initiative. The voting itself in the bloc is arranged according to the unanimous principle. If at least one country is against, then no decision is made. Supporters of the Ukraine's entry into NATO were the United States, Poland, and a lot of other Eastern European countries. So this question raised domestic political issues. The leading party in power in Ukraine was then the Party of Regions, and it began to oppose such a decision, because Yushchenko didn't discuss the issue of submitting such an application in the parliament. Public sentiment was also generally against the loss of the neutrality. Only 20% of the residents supported the initiative of Ukraine's accession to NATO. In general, the attempt to sign the action plan wasn't successful. But if this had happened, then it would be possible to believe that Ukraine in 5 or 7 years would have joined NATO. There was actually big chance. I'm just speechless. If only people knew then that Russia would attack the east of Ukraine in 2014, annex Crimea, and attack us in full scale in 2022. It would be better for all residents to vote amicably for joining NATO. If in the case of Yushchenko, he was in favor of this decision, but only 20% of Ukrainians were. Then the complete stoppage of integration into the alliance began with the coming to power Viktor Yanukovych, who was known for memes with his participation, for his pronounced pro-Russian orientation, and aimed at strengthening relations with Russia. The active continuation of the process of rapprochement with NATO, which was started during previous governments, was stopped. Yanukovych opposed the Ukrainians' membership in NATO and declared that the country would maintain its neutrality, which actually meant rapprochement with Russia. Under Yanukovych, a decision was also made to cancel the law that regulated the prospect of Ukraine's membership in NATO. This was perceived as a sign of move from Euro-Atlantic ambitions and be more pro-Russian. Then in 2014, because of really pro-Russian policy of Viktor Yanukovych, a revolution of dignity takes place in Ukraine. The Ukrainians expel him from the post loss of president and he flees to Russia. A terrorist state attacks Ukraine seized, annexes Crimea, and now it's worth looking at our statistics of Ukrainians who support joining NATO. An incredible jump took place in 2014. Then the next president, Petro Poroshenko, in 2015 officially announced the course of joining NATO for the sake of the country's security, to which NATO replied that we have really big problems joining the alliance, and it won't be soon. During the Poroshenko period, joining NATO was primarily complicated by disputed territories and the conflict in Donbass. In addition, Ukraine has made a little progress on requirements to join the alliance. To join NATO, a country must fulfill a number of criteria, including democratic reforms, the rule of law, the development of military forces, and in general compatibility with the alliance standards. In the case of Ukraine, the demands are not only military but also political, including the elimination of corruption and democratization. This means that Ukraine must continue to reform its political system, strengthen the independence of the judiciary, improve anti-corruption mechanism, and ensure transparency in government. With the advent of Zelensky in 2019, the NATO course was continued. The new president again began to insist that Ukraine needed a plan for membership in the alliance, which was first discussed under Yushchenko. Despite all attempts, the leadership of the alliance didn't give a membership plan, although this time a support was at a fairly high level. Turkish President Erdogan was extremely supportive of this idea. During the pre-war crisis, Russia began to demand guarantees from the Western countries that Ukraine would not join NATO and would be neutral. According to the NATO doctrine, any country in the region can apply, and NATO bloc refused such promises not to violate its own principles. Not so long ago, it became known that Scholz in negotiations with Putin nevertheless gave him a promise that Ukraine would not join NATO, but this didn't stop Putin either. The NATO alliance itself as a structure set as its main goal the avoidance of direct clash with Russia. Then NATO received the first request to close the sky, which was denied. It seemed that at the beginning of the full-scale war, the issue of joining NATO was buried. However, on September 30, the president signed a decree on the accelerated entry of Ukraine into NATO, in response to the annexation of part of Ukrainian territory by Russia. This decree was supported by many Eastern European countries, but NATO representatives said that such an issue can be discussed only after the end of the war. Otherwise, the fifth article of NATO would be activated, which would turn it into a direct war between NATO and Russia, which bloc is trying to avoid in the light of the threat of nuclear war. And now let's finally look on the statistics of how many Ukrainians support joining NATO in 2022. And the number is really impressive. 83% for joining NATO. Do you want Ukraine to join NATO? Write down in the comments section. Personally, I hope that it will happen immediately after the victory. Also, put your big like, because it motivates me to do more videos. And if you want to support me, you can do it on Patreon, link in the description below. And that's it. Thank you, Royals. See ya.